Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon. In honor of Carol Curtin, Anastasia Kusek, and Natalie Vomidown, I welcome you to Neighbours, Friends, and Families Healthy Talk series, a rural inquest, the role of neighbors, friends, and families in keeping women safe. We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinongton nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sambor Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. And now, I would like to introduce our speakers who will lead the conversation today. We have Pamela Cross. Pamela Cross is a feminist lawyer, a well-known and respected expert on violence against women and the law for her work as a researcher, writer, educator, and trainer. Pamela is now the Luke's Place Advocacy Director. We also have Erin Lee. Erin is an experienced, passionate advocate who has spent decades working to end violence against women. Currently, Erin is the Executive Director of Lenape County Interval House and Community Support. Welcome, Erin and Pam. Along with Pamela and Erin, we have Barbara McQuarrie, Community Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, and project lead of the Neighbours, Friends, and Families campaign at the center. And now I would like to pass it over to our speakers to give some background information about the Inquest. In addition, also, there will be a link in the chat box about where to find help in case during the session you need to have that information about finding access to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Anushka. I'm going to lead us off this afternoon. I want to start by saying that we really want this to be a conversation. Obviously, the three of us have a few things that we have prepared to share with you in terms of information and our own thoughts and reflections, both on the inquest and what grew out of it, and on the role of neighbors, friends, and families. But we really do want this to be an opportunity for all of us to engage in conversation about how we can move collaboratively forward. And to that end, we're certainly encouraging you to post questions in the Q&A. We'll come to them at the end, although if somebody is really struggling with something that one of us has said, you don't understand it, it doesn't make sense, Anushka, perhaps you can keep an eye on that Q&A and if necessary, interrupt us just to clarify something. But overall, we'll do a presentation and then leave quite a bit of time for a conversation with all of you. And we're going to go back and forth among ourselves in this conversation as well. I've agreed to start us off, and I'm going to first of all talk a little bit about the murders in 2015 to set that context, and then talk to you a little bit about what inquests are, what their role is, and what this inquest in particular did. And then I'm going to move on to asking Erin to share some thoughts with us and so on. So we'll kind of move around among ourselves here. You already heard Anushka dedicate this conversation to the memory of Carol Culleton, Anastasia Kusek, and Natalie Warmerdam. These were three women who were living their lives in and around Renfrew County in 2015. They all had had intimate relationships of one kind or another with the perpetrator in the years leading up to September 22nd, 2015. None of those were ongoing relationships. However, as is all too common when we start to look at domestic violence homicides, the perpetrator wasn't ready for those relationships to end. He wanted to continue to have engagement with each of these women. There had been a history of controlling behavior, abusive behavior. In two cases, there had been some amount of police involvement, some criminal court involvement, and some engagement on the part of the perpetrator, or at least there should have been engagement on the part of the perpetrator with services like probation and the PAR program. But on September 22nd, 2015, none of those three women was particularly thinking about the perpetrator. They were going about their daily business. And at a very short period of time in that morning, each of them was killed at their home, or in the case of Carol, at her cottage, in incidents that came very quickly, one on the heels of the one before. The final killing had happened really before the police knew about the first one. It would be an understatement to say that those killings shook Renfrew County, in particular the communities immediately adjacent to where the women were killed. None of us expect this kind of thing to happen in our neighborhood. And I think that may be particularly true in rural communities where people have a very different way of relating to one another than some of us who live in larger urban areas. And that's why it's so appropriate, I think, for this webinar to be happening through neighbors, friends, and families, because a lot of the story of what led up to the murders, what followed, and where we are now with recommendations coming out of the inquest, a lot of that is about neighbors, friends, and families, and how we all need to get better at understanding this issue of intimate partner violence, understanding how it can escalate very quickly, and knowing what our roles are or should be in helping to ensure that those who are often the victims of this violence, including children, are as safe as possible. So in terms of the actual murders, once they happened, the perpetrator was arrested that same day. There never was an issue from his perspective about getting away. The trial took place almost 2 years after the murders, which was a very long time for Renfrew County, for people who were grieving the loss of these three women. But that's how our criminal system works in Canada. It is very, very slow. He was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Because of his age at the time, it is extremely unlikely that he will ever leave prison. I think you all know that life sentences in Canada don't really mean life, they mean 25 years. But when you've got 3 of them stacked up, and when you're already around 60 when you get sentenced, it's pretty unlikely that you're coming out of jail. So that's a snapshot of what happened on September 22nd, 2015, and the immediate aftermath in terms of the criminal proceeding, which is really only a very small part of the story in many ways. One of the things that I was struck by right from the beginning, and I was spending a lot of time in Renfrew County immediately following the murders, was how engaged the community became right off the bat. There were vigils, there were meetings, there were conversations, there were support groups. And of course, the women's services and the women's community in Renfrew County took on a huge role in coordinating and leading many of those activities, which was exhausting and demanding on organizations that were small, that were not particularly adequately funded to do their usual job, and now we're suddenly taking on a whole lot of other work. The community was very engaged with the criminal trial. And in fact, at the sentencing phase of that trial, the community submitted what's called a community impact statement, very similar to a victim impact statement. But this was a statement from the community saying, here's how we as a community have been affected by this crime, and we want you, the judge, to take that into account when you're passing sentence. And the judge did. I was in the courtroom on the day that the sentence was read out, and he referred at least twice when announcing the penalty for the perpetrator that he had been very affected by the statement from the community. So let's fast forward to 2022 when the inquest was held, almost 7 years after the murders had taken place. For many people in Renfrew County, their lives had gone back to normal, whatever that normal might look like. But for family members, for friends of the women who had been killed, and for many of those in the community who had provided services to either the victims or the perpetrator, that murder really still hung in the air for them, even almost 7 years later. It was an unusually long time between the murders and the inquest, largely because of our good friend COVID, which slowed so much down around the world over the last several years. That slowdown was in part because the coroner's office, which is responsible for inquests, was very committed to holding the inquest in Renfrew County, largely because the community had been so engaged at the time of the murders. If the inquest had been virtual, it probably could have happened a year or even more than a year earlier than it did. But before I talk a little bit about this inquest, I want to just give you a bit of information about what inquests are, because many of you may see that word in a headline and it doesn't really affect your life, so you haven't thought about it a whole lot. And often people get inquests and inquiries confused. I don't want to make this a boring start, but it's important to understand the distinction. So this was an inquest, not an inquiry. An inquiry can be called by a province, by the federal government, jointly. In many ways, they're similar, but in an inquiry, there does not have to have been a death. In an inquest, there has to have been a death. That's what kickstarts the possibility of an inquest. They're a function of provincial or territorial legislation. So only a provincial or territorial government can call an inquest. Most of them, and this is true in Ontario, operate through the coroner's office, which has oversight of all deaths in the province. In Ontario, inquests are automatically held into some deaths. A death on a construction site, for instance, automatically results in an inquest. Same if somebody dies while they're working in a mining operation. Same if somebody dies in certain circumstances when they're incarcerated or otherwise being held against their will. But the murder of women, femicide, does not lead automatically to an inquest. And I think we can see that if that were the case, and indeed it was one of the recommendations, there would be a lot of inquests every year because so many women are killed. The coroner has the discretion to call an inquest anytime they think the death or an examination of the death, or in this case, deaths, could lead to a better understanding of what happened, which then in turn could lead to some recommendations for changing systems to hopefully reduce the number of deaths in similar circumstances in the future. So that's the focus, systemic change. It's not about guilt or innocence. It's not about holding somebody liable. It's not supposed to be about criticizing individuals for what they did. It's intended to look at systems. Once the coroner decides that there will be an inquest, both organizations and individuals can be given what's called standing, which means they're part of the inquest. They can appear, they can call witnesses, they can question witnesses. They have to have some kind of connection to what's happened. So a femicide inquest, violence against women organizations are logical parties, family members. The province is often a party to an inquest because very often the recommendations are directed to the province. Then there's a jury, 5 people picked from the community where the deaths took place, who sit in the inquest room and listen to all of the evidence that's presented by witnesses. They read written evidence. And this is something I didn't know until the first day of the inquest. They get to ask questions. So it's not like a criminal trial where the jury just sits there silently, maybe taking their notes or what have you. The jury can engage with the witnesses. And as Erin can concur, this jury did engage with the witnesses. They had lots of questions, and they were really good questions. These 5 people worked so hard over the 3 weeks of the inquest to understand intimate partner violence, to understand the systems that should be supporting both survivors and perpetrators. And they just asked question after question if something was unclear or if they thought they were getting the runaround from a witness. So the jury's job is to issue a verdict after they've listened to all of the evidence, and they can, if they choose to do so, make recommendations for change. I spent a lot of time looking at the coroner's office inquest section on their website just before this inquest, because I've never been involved with one before. And there are a lot of inquests where no recommendations are made. Often there's just one or two. Sometimes there's more than 100. In this inquest, there were 86, and we'll talk more about that later. Before this inquest, there had been two official inquests into domestic violence homicide. The 1998 inquest into the death of Arlene May, who was killed by her boyfriend, and the 2002 inquest into the death of Gillian Hadley, who was killed by her husband, who also killed himself. But there have been at least two other inquests, which, while not considered domestic violence inquests, show us the interconnections and how a domestic violence situation can lead to the death of somebody else who's not the partner. In 2007, and Barb has quite a bit of familiarity with this inquest, I believe, an inquest was held into the 2005 murder of a nurse, Laurie DuPont, in Windsor, Ontario. She was killed by her former partner, who was a doctor at the same hospital that she worked at. But that inquest was framed as a workplace violence death more than a domestic violence death. There was a past intimate partner relationship. He had been coercively controlling. He had been stalking and harassing her. So it really does qualify as a domestic violence homicide as well, even though what the inquest focused on more was how do we make workplaces safer for women who may be or have been in relationships where they've been abused. Then in 2012, there was an inquest into the shooting death of an OPP officer, Vu Pham. In 2010, Vu Pham responded to a domestic violence call involving a man who was stalking his wife at her sister's home. His wife wasn't there, but he thought she was. And so he had kind of just positioned himself outside her home. The police were called in. This particular officer responded to that call. It was in a rural location. And he, the abuser, shot and killed the police officer. And then he himself was shot and later died from his injuries. So here somebody's killed who has nothing to do with the family, but they were actively involved because the perpetrator was engaging in domestic violence. One of the things that made the CKW inquest, and that's for the last names of each of the women, the CKW inquest, unique, was that it specifically looked at the issue of intimate partner violence and femicide in rural communities. And so the conversations were very much focused on what's different about rural communities compared to urban communities at the system levels, and what kinds of systems need to change to better respond to domestic violence or to intimate partner violence in those communities. And in addition to that, stop those situations from escalating to a femicide. So very briefly, and then I'm going to ask Erin to join the conversation, just so you know where I fit into what I'm telling you about this afternoon. I was a witness at the inquest. I was retained by the coroner's office to produce an expert report on intimate partner violence in Ontario. And so I appeared as a witness to share that report and answer questions from the jurors. But I also had been hired by the Women's Coalition End Violence Against Women Renfrew County to hold consultations before the inquest began in the community to hear from community members who wouldn't be called as witnesses, because EVA, End Violence Against Women, very much wanted to ensure that this community voice that had been so important at the time of the murders and through the criminal trial continued to be heard. And so I appeared a second time as a witness to present the report that I had written based on those community consultations. And finally, Canadian Women's Foundation provided funding so I could attend the full inquest and write a report about it, which I've actually turned into a toolkit more than a report, but we're going to come back and talk about that at the end. So that's the perspective I was bringing, and that's the access to information that I had. Erin was also involved in the inquest. She was there as a witness at one point, but she was often there as a member of the public, although hardly a member of the public given her work. But so Erin, you came in and out. You weren't there every day, but you were there frequently. On one occasion, you brought a number of your new staff so they could see how an inquest works. Can you talk a little bit about what for you was the most important thing to come out of the inquest?
Good afternoon. Sure. I think that I just want to contextualize that what you kind of alluded to, which was that I when we think about this from a neighbors, friends, and family perspective, I'm the neighbor. So I represent the neighboring county to Renfrew County, which is Lanark County. So interestingly enough, it was often laughed about because when somebody would ask me to do something, I would say, yes, I will do that as the neighbor. Very mindful and very respectful that as the neighbor, my role was to support. My role was to offer guidance where requested. And my role was to ensure that the voices of the local folks was heard and responded to where perhaps it wouldn't have been otherwise. So it is true. I was in and out of the inquest. I do want to say that one of the things I think is significant about this inquest is that it was in the community. It was in the community. It was open to the public. It was accessible in all ways that you could think of in terms of presence, in terms of mental health supports being in the room, in terms of response and welcomeness. It was accessible to folks. It was trauma informed. It was really committed to ensuring that the community understood that this is their process. And so the folks that came from Toronto and that represented the coroner's office and the province and the parties were really mindful and really respectful of the fact that they were entering into a rural community who had experienced trauma and was healing. So that was huge in terms of a learning and an opportunity to do things differently when we can, and to ensure that rural realities are actually taken into consideration. So I gave testimony. My testimony was really to talk about rural realities, some of the variables and some of the approaches to the work that is unique and perhaps creative as it relates to rural response and engagement. I was invited to be part of the working group, so I was an honorary member of EVA, which I remain an honorary member today. And so we attended many, many meetings together. So I was there in an official capacity on some days and other days, not so much. And I felt that the inquest was, if we're going to have an inquest and we're going to have an inquest into the murders, the feminicides, 3 women in a rural community, this is also a gift of sorts in terms of a teaching tool for new and upcoming advocates who really want to understand and be immersed and understand the work. And they can learn from the folks like Barb, and they can learn from Pam, and they can learn from myself, or they can attend when there's an opportunity presented. So it was really important for me as an advocate and as a community leader to engage staff and offer an opportunity for them to attend. From Lanark County to the site of the inquest is about a 2-hour drive. So prep was not a problem, and debriefing wasn't a problem either. The actual experience, one of our staff, when they were talking about the remarkable things in honoring IWD, they were talking about the remarkable things that spoke to equity, embracing equity for them this year. She actually talked about attending the inquest, and that the inquest, that opportunity was the most memorable and most important thing around empowerment and supporting new advocates. That was her sharing on March the 8th, which I thought was really an honor to Carol and Anastasia and Natalie. So I think that was huge. I think it's a huge learning anytime people are able to hear jurors asking really difficult questions and challenging those giving witness and giving testimony. I think the jury was also an amazing gift to community because they were local community members. They weren't chosen because they had a particular influence, particular knowledge, particular power, or role in community. They were chosen the same way that jurors are chosen in a jury process and a jury pool. So they were local people who live locally, who had to learn a lot in a very short period of time, and they took their roles seriously. And all of those pieces, I guess, for me, Pam, speak to the most important thing that happened as a result of the inquest. The inquest united community, and the jury gave us the roadmap to stay united and to move towards change and to continue to build that momentum as we move forward. And you don't forget about the one person you met in the hallway who you didn't know, the person you shared the box lunch with in the hotel room across the way, who you would never have met had you not been engaged in this process that was really rooted in community. So that is my very long way, I suppose, of saying that the most important was the uniting of community, the healing process together, and the roadmap the jury gave us to continue that work.
Thank you so much for that,
I'm
Erin.
just going to add a bit to what Erin said, actually, because listening to you reminded me of a couple of things I haven't thought about since last June. You talked about the trauma-informed approach, and I think for all of us, that was different, right? We probably expected a more formal process. And a lot of the credit for that goes to the presiding officer, who was an unusually gifted, gentle leader who, took us through those 3 weeks and made sure that we started on time and ended on time, and all of the necessary rules were followed, but also created a space that felt quite safe. On top of that, as you mentioned, there were mental health workers in the room. Those mental health workers also reached out at lunchtime. They had meditation sessions for anybody who wanted to join them. If somebody looked like they were struggling, the mental health worker would approach the person. There was a quiet room that they could go to. And coming out of that, something I hadn't anticipated at all before the inquest was that survivors started to come and go from the inquest and would just sit in the public space and watch and listen. And sometimes some of us would have conversation with them, and sometimes we wouldn't. But I talked to at least one survivor who told me that coming to that inquest, she never said a word, but coming to that inquest and seeing that people were talking openly about situations like hers made her feel better about herself, made her feel able to move ahead in her own healing process. So, as we talk, and we're going to this afternoon, about the formal outcomes of the inquest, things like those recommendations and what we do with them, I don't want to lose sight of the kinds of things that, Erin, you were just talking about, and also the significant impact that the inquest had on individual survivors.
Thanks so much for that. And actually, Pam, now that you've raised the question of like what were the outcomes, that is essentially my question to you. And if you could provide some information about that.
As Erin has said, the jury brought back 86 recommendations. Don't worry, we're not going to read all 86 of them to you, but at the end we'll give you a link to where you can read them if you like. I thought it might be helpful, though, if we gave you a bit of the background. How did they get to 86 recommendations? Certainly, they heard a lot of ideas from the different witnesses for things that could be done better in the future. Some of the witnesses actually gave sort of proposed recommendations in their remarks, in their testimony. So they would say, we'd like to see the jury recommend this or recommend that. And so over the course of the 3 weeks, the coroner's office, which was present throughout the proceedings, obviously, kept track of all of those different ideas for recommendations. And here's where I was really happy I wasn't an official part of the team running the inquest, because in the last 24 hours, the coroner's team, the lawyer for the party, Eva was a party at the inquest, the adult child of one of the victims who was a party also, but represented himself, and the province, the lawyer for the province, they pulled pretty much a 24-hour no sleep, the kind of thing I haven't done since I was in university, which is a long time ago now, to pull together all the threads of ideas that had come up over 3 weeks. And they kind of bundled them into different themes. And then they came up with, Erin, I actually forget, but I think it was 70 some suggestions to the jury of recommendations that the jury might want to consider. Now, the jury could have thrown all of those out the window and started over. In this case, that didn't happen. On the last day before the jury went into deliberations, they listened to the suggestions, which were presented by the various lawyers who were there, and then off they went. They had their two great big binders full of evidence. They had everything that was in their heads. They had all their notes, and they had these 70 some suggestions. And they came back, I think it was the following Tuesday, so from a Friday to a Tuesday, and they presented 86 recommendations. They brought forward all of the 70 some that had been suggested, and then they thought of, I think it was another 12 themselves. And those recommendations cover a huge gamut. They look at things like accountability, system accountability, transparency, funding, responses to perpetrators, supports for victims, education of every kind, public education, education for kids in schools, education for professionals. There were recommendations about gun control, recommendations about possible changes to legislation. So 86 altogether. 68 of those were directed at the provincial government. And then there were a few directed to the federal government, one to the Information and Privacy Commissioner, I can't remember now, 4 or 5 directed to the coroner's office itself, and a few more directed at the chief firearms officer. I think that's the totality of how they were divided up. But the vast majority of them went to the provincial government, which is not surprising because the province is the body that's responsible for most programming and services in this area. And most of the recommendations looked at that. So on the day that the jury came back with its verdict, including its recommendations, we all gathered once again in the location where the inquest had been held. And I have to say, I think we were all a little bit shaken when that proceeding started because we had just heard the news that 2 women in Ottawa had been killed the night before, a mother and her daughter, and the other daughter shot but not killed by a male perpetrator, the young man whose family lived next door to where these 3 women lived. And it was very eerie to sit in a room listening to recommendations coming out of the murders of 3 women 7 years before, as a new community was grieving the immediate death of 2 women in its neighborhood, in its area. The jury read its recommendations out loud. They took turns. And I can tell you that was also very powerful. These weren't just handed out in sheets of paper. They weren't just read by the presiding officer. The people who had sat there, as Erin says, and listened and learned and probably been shocked and horrified more times than they could remember, actually read their own recommendations out loud. And I can tell you that when the first recommendation was read out loud, and this was a recommendation to the province in the theme of accountability, that intimate partner violence be declared an epidemic in Ontario, you could hear there were lots of journalists there that day too. You could hear everybody gasp because it was in a way, such a shocking recommendation and yet such an obvious one. I think that's the only way I can describe it. This had not come from the parties to the inquest. This was a recommendation from the 5 jurors as they reflected on what they had heard and learned about how serious this problem is, of course, in Ontario, because that's what they were looking at, but we know it's a problem around the world. And here was this brilliant and yet so simple recommendation, a recommendation that wouldn't cost 1 penny to implement, that required only that the Premier of Ontario stand up and say, intimate partner violence has reached epidemic proportions in this province. And, because this isn't a mystery and you don't need to wait till the last page to find out what happens, I'm going to tell you right now, the province has failed to do that. We are almost 10 months since the end of the inquest, and the province has not done that. And Erin will talk in a few minutes about how we're seeing this play out in a number of communities. But that was the first recommendation. And then it took almost an hour for them to read through all of the other recommendations. And I'm going to go right to the last one because it ties back to the first one. Recommendation 86, which was made to all of the parties at the inquest. And that called for everyone to gather again on the first anniversary of the inquest to assess what progress had been made on implementing the recommendations. And as Barb and Erin will probably both remember, and maybe some of you who've joined us this afternoon, that was a recommendation also made by the Gillian Hadley jury, worded slightly differently. But that jury too had concerns because that inquest happened 4 years after the inquest into the murder of Arlene May. And Arlene May's inquest led to 262 recommendations, very few of which had been implemented by the time Gillian Hadley was killed. So the jury in the Gillian Hadley inquest thought, well, we're not just going to hand over our recommendations and hope for the best because we see what happens when we do that, nothing. And so they made a recommendation, and that jury did reconvene a year later and hold a press conference at Queen's Park. So we have a very similar kind of recommendation here 20 years later from a jury that clearly wants to make sure that the work that it did, but also the work that the community did, hasn't been done for nothing. And so in between that recommendation 1 and recommendation 86, there are 84 more, many of which could be implemented at minimal cost, many of which have been recommended before by previous inquests, by the annual reports of Ontario's Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, have been recommended in academic research, in community engaged research. Yes, there were some brand new ideas in those 86 recommendations, but overwhelmingly, these are ideas that other governments have been presented with that they have failed to act on. Which is, that can be a sort of discouraging feeling. That's not where we're headed here. And I'm going to flip things back to Erin now, because Lanark County, where Erin is, has really responded in quite a phenomenal way to the inquest. And I think for many of us, it's been a beacon of hope, and we've seen that spread out across the province. I'll talk a little more about that shortly. But Erin, why don't you lead us off by talking about what's gone on in Lanark County since the inquest, and actually maybe go back to 2016 for a minute and talk about those forums that you organized back then.
Sure. At the time that the triple femicide happened in Renfrew County, most of us in this agency can remember exactly where we were. Maybe many of you could remember where you were. The difference might have been that in this community, in our staff room, people were receiving messages from their family members saying, I'm under the table. Johnny's school is on lockdown. What the devil is happening? That's how close we are in terms of that shared experience. And we may be the tertiary kind of victims in an analysis, but certainly we felt that. And unfortunately, what happened is those 3 femicides happened, and there were another 4 murders where we lost in rural Eastern Ontario. We lost 7 people in a period of 7 months to the hands of violence. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm very solution focused, and I'm very clear about who needs to provide the resources to help us find those solutions. And I went directly to the director of Social Ministry of Community and Social Services and said, we need some help. Rural Eastern Ontario is facing some hugely problematic, tragic murders, and we need to be able to gather as a community to talk about our own strategies, how we lean on each other in rural communities, and what we can do to make that different in terms of when we talk about root causes. How do we look at responding to that? So the ministry gave us some money. We hosted 4 what we call the rural forums. The rural forums were hosted in each of the communities, Lennox and Addington, Renfrew County, Lanark County, and then we had one culminating event in Perth, Ontario, where people were invited from all of the various forums that we hosted. The agenda for every forum was the same facilitators, same ministry reps invited, same partner relationship, partner membership invited, and the same invitee list. So it invited everyone. It invited community members, it invited politicians, teachers, every sector was invited to attend these events. And then we looked at these events and we came up with plans at every one of them. And then we looked at where there were similarities and where there were uniqueness. And as you could imagine, because they were rural communities, there was a lot of overlap in terms of isolation and transportation and cell service and gun risk and all of those things. So we were already working together as rural communities when all of this happened, and we were already responding together. So when excuse me, when the inquest happened, it made sense that we were again taking up that team approach, kind of like lean on each other, let's support each other through this process. And then out came the roadmap, as I often refer to it in a most respectful way. And in our community in Lanark County, we were like, this is not over. This is an adjunct to the work we've already been doing, and it's going to help us push the envelope for real, meaningful, and sustainable change, right, in communities. So immediately talked to our local radio station. The local radio station says, why don't we, I said, could we talk about the recommendations on the radio sometime and keep it front and center for the public, for our community members who are listening. And then he said, oh, well, why don't we do one recommendation a week? And I said, oh, sure. Because I didn't know if he realized there were 86. And I didn't know if he realized that a commitment to one a week is 86 weeks. Sometimes, as I think about being at recommendation 25, I think to myself, wow, that was quite an undertaking. But local small radio station took the leadership and said, yes, it is newsworthy. We'll do one a week. So we do one a week where they read a recommendation. And then I am currently the voice who responds to, what does that mean? What does that mean in kind of street terms? What does it mean? And what could the community do to support that? And so now, not only can you go to a link and you can read those recommendations, you can also go to Lake 88 and you can go to the recommendations section and you could listen to one recommendation a week if you wanted to, just so that you can think for yourself about how you feel about those recommendations and what you can do as a community member and a leader who's probably either a neighbor, a friend, or a family member to someone who's faced violence or may face violence. Ottawa City News, Pam can tell you that Ottawa City News has us on speed dial. The first thing that the Sam LaPrade show did was they dedicated 6 episodes, consecutive episodes, to talking about intimate partner violence and the inquest. And so, we certainly had the momentum of the media. We had print papers and articles. We had we were talking, both of us, to the Globe and Mail as recently as yesterday about our reaction and our response to what the government hasn't done, what it has done, and so on. Again, I went back to MCCSS and I said, these inquests are really, really important, but we can't continue to work on these, moving them forward without some funds. So then, lo and behold, they came back to a meeting with myself and Joanne Brooks and says, we have $20,000. Could you work with that to, of course, do March 31st? And of course, we're used to that. So we said, absolutely. And that was the first step, right? That was the first concrete move of somebody connected to the government saying, we see value in these recommendations. We will allocate $20,000 from rural enhancement dollars for you, for Renfrew County and for Lanark County to continue to move these recommendations forward. To me, again, really good leverage for us to understand that there is a will. We just have to continue to nurture those relationships. Events are continuing to happen. We hosted an event in Leonard County in December. We had 4 people from the Inquest who testified, come and offer their reflections, their hopes, and the hope for action in the future. So on a night in a rural community in December, 150 or so local members of our community came out and participated in that. And that's when I think, and I don't know for Pam or for Barb, but that's when it really occurred to me. This inquest and these recommendations are now being embraced and are completely belonging to community. And rural communities are saying, we've had enough. We're ready. What can we do? Let's get doing that. And let's figure out how to demand for that change together. And I know Julie Lalonde, she was very, very clear at that event in December. She said, if this was happening in a city, you wouldn't have 150 plus people coming out on a cold evening, bitterly cold. It was very cold that night, coming out to talk about a rural inquest and what to do about violence against women and intimate partner violence. So lots of conversations are going on locally. Our Leonard County Council requested an audience at Roma with Minister Fullerton, as well as with Associate Minister Williams. They made that request before they did the big resolution. I was the representative. I traveled with them and I wrote the brief, but they, all 10 of them that were at Roma, attended that small room with me and the 2 ministers and their staff to have a conversation about the inquest. And I often say to rural politicians, normally it's just a couple of people that come in with the presenter who's presenting the brief. It's okay. You don't all have to come. And they said, no, we know we don't all have to come. We want to come because this is as much our issue as it is yours. So those are the messages of community in rural communities. And then, of course, on December the 7th, I approached the council, the Leonard County Council, and I said, yesterday was December 6th. We honored the same 14 women we honored in 1989. Today is December the 7th. We need to honor Carol and Anastasia and Natalie, and I need to ask you to do something. To which they said, basically, what? And I asked them, I said, I want you to look at the recommendations, and I want you to take recommendation number 1, and I want you to embrace it, and I want you to declare that intimate partner violence is an epidemic. Unbeknownst to me, they actually agreed and decided to unanimously pass that resolution after I sat in the back of a council chamber, writing it fast and furiously and submitting it. They passed it unanimously that night, and on the 14th of December, the council as a whole passed that, and they made 3 amendments. If you have ever been an advocate that's had to go and deal with your county council, your provincial politicians, when they approach you with amendments, you're usually quite nervous. And generally you feel like that's it. My resolution is gone. My motion is gone. They're making it theirs, and it's no longer going to reflect our intention. But I will tell you that better than mine, it enhanced that. It said, Erin, would you be okay if we sent it to all 444 municipalities in Ontario? I said, oh, no, that would be okay. And then they said, would you be okay if we asked you to give us a list of ministers, both provincially and federally, that you'd like this to be drawn to their attention? I said, oh, I think that would be okay. And then they said, would you be okay if, we brought this to attention to the roundtables and the leaders of Roma and AMO, which are all kind of rural municipalities of organizations? And I said, no, that would be okay. And then they said, so you accept all 3 amendments as friendly amendments? I said, those are the most friendly amendments I've ever heard in my career. So they made those amendments because it mattered to them. As you all may know, it has taken on a life of its own now. And we've had other municipal townships pass the resolution, and on IWD last week at the city of Ottawa also made the resolution and the declaration that intimate partner violence is an epidemic. Many townships are looking at it and are exploring it. All of that to say that there are lots of things, from building a bigger wave to regional coordinating meetings to folks in the north and Wawa looking at passing that resolution in their community. Other things I know that Pam will speak to in terms of the toolkit. But what Lanark County's Rural Council did was they set the stage and they said to the province, we're taking action. We're recognizing the value of the experiences and the voices in rural communities. And I'm saying the province needs to meet us on the road. We've taken the roadmap, we've opened it up, and we're on it. And the province needs to meet us somewhere on that road. And IWD would have been a great opportunity for our premier, for the province to make a statement and to make that declaration. Because honestly, if you're working towards ending violence and ending intimate partner violence, the cost is nothing. It's negligible to make that kind of declaration. I'm going to turn it back to you, Pam, and to you, Barb, because I get really passionate when I talk about local action and all the things that are happening in local communities that are really saying to the province, oh yeah, tomorrow's too late. We're on it. So with that, I'm going to mute myself for a little bit and pass that energy over to my colleagues for further comments.
Thanks, Erin. Barb, I'm just going to make a couple of comments about the reaction across the province in smaller communities. And then I'd really like you to start to remind everybody who's here with us this afternoon about neighbors, friends, and families. And then we can talk about how those things intersect. Because to me, it's just like a perfect coming together of different energies. Just as Erin was talking about the way Lanark County really rose to the occasion after the inquest, has been a very common experience across the province. I had the opportunity through October and November to visit many parts of Ontario, from as far north as Wawa and down through that area, through the mid-north, and then down to small and rural communities in southwestern Ontario. And people really wanted to talk about the inquest. Of course, violence against women workers wanted to talk about it, but so did community coordinating committees, many of which had been kind of sidelined, especially during the pandemic. I mean, any of you who are involved with coordinating committees know that they've historically struggled because there's a certain tension sometimes among the people who sit at those tables, the criminal side people and the grassroots community people. But then the pandemic made it really difficult for those coordinating committees to get together. And so I think the timing of the inquest and the recommendations coming after there had been a huge surge in the rate of intimate partner violence because of the pandemic, more media attention paid to intimate partner violence, I think, than ever in all the years I've worked on this issue. The inquest and coordinating committees looking for a way to get themselves re-engaged. All of that came together in a very effective way. And like in Lanark County, what I heard everywhere I went was, well, we're not going to wait for the province to figure out what it's going to do. There's stuff we can do here right now. So women in Wawa saying, okay, we're going to put together a caravan and we're going to come to Renfrew County on June 28th, 2023. We don't know what's going to happen there, but we want to be part of it. And partly as a result of my having heard that in many parts of the province, Luke's Place is now going to be holding a women's conference in Petawawa in Renfrew County over those days in June. So if folks want to come because they want to hold the inquest process accountable, hold the province accountable to the inquest process, they'll have a structure that they'll be coming towards wherever they come from. When I was in southwestern Ontario, people on coordinating committees, people on high risk teams were talking about, we need to figure out these recommendations about information sharing and privacy, because we need to make our communities safer, and we cannot do that if we're always being told we're not allowed to share information, which is one of the reasons why I'm so pleased that the Information and Privacy Commissioner has given such a positive response to the recommendation directed at her office. And that office is now working and consulting widely with community groups to develop a plain language guide to understanding privacy legislation in Ontario, so people will feel less constrained, less worried that they're breaking a law when they share information to help keep a survivor safe. So really, I have done a lot of activist work over most of my life, so for more than 50 years. And campaigns are always energizing while they're happening. But I have to say, I haven't seen this kind of engagement or interest in a long time. And so even though the inquest itself was really difficult to sit through, it was emotionally painful, it was sad, some days very sad, heartbreaking. Other days, those of us in the room were so angry. There were some days I was texting Erin, who wasn't in the room, to say, like, I can't talk about it in here, but it's just, I'm so angry. I can't believe what I just heard. But ultimately, at the end of it, I actually came out of that process with more hope than I have felt in a long time, because it spoke to people, and people said, we're going to do something. So I'm going to ask Barb to talk a bit about Neighbours, Friends and Families, and then I'm hoping there's still a bit of time for me to mention some of the tools we've developed for folks to use, and then time to hear from you with your comments or questions. Barb, over to you.
Thanks, Pam. And I'm going to ask Christine Wildman to turn her camera on for a moment too, because Christine is going to be on a go-forward basis the face of Neighbours, Friends and Families, and really she's the greatest resource this campaign has in terms of helping you figure out how to use the tools. So Neighbours, Friends and Families is it really, the foundation is these caring that you're talking about. The ordinary people care a lot about intimate partner violence. And through the years and all of the work that we've done with Neighbours, Friends and Families, if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that. It's, you know, I think maybe I might have had an assumption at some point that if you're not working in the field, then, you know, you don't really care that much. That is not the case. But what is true is that many people who don't work in some way addressing violence against women or intimate partner violence on a daily basis, faced with a situation, they don't know what to do. Or sometimes they're not even sure if what they're seeing is actually an abusive relationship. And so that's where Neighbours, Friends and Families come in. It's a set of really basic tools, like the most basic level of understanding what is intimate partner violence, understanding when does a situation become more dangerous, what makes a situation more dangerous, and then how do we respond, not as experts. The campaign never wants you to take on the role of an expert, but there's lots of things that we can do as neighbors, as friends, as family members. And the other thing that the campaign is really hyper aware of is that in the vast majority of cases, before any police officer, before any social worker, before any nurse or doctor is going to learn about the situation, a neighbor, a friend, or a family member is going to know. You're the first to know. And it's really unfair that we put so little effort into preparing you for how to respond to those situations that come up, honestly, at some point in our lives for most of us. So Neighbours, Friends and Families has a website. We'll put the link in the chat. And what you will find there is what I'm telling you, really basic information that's organized around that idea of what are the warning signs? What are the things that tell you, I should really pay more attention to this. Maybe I should ask more questions. And then if you're pretty sure that this is an abusive relationship, the next piece is, how do I know if this situation is getting more dangerous? And so we'll teach you about those risk factors. And then we spend a lot of time just encouraging you and giving you simple strategies for reaching out and actually talking to somebody that you're concerned about. And this is the hardest piece, because we've all been socialized to say, that's private, that's none of our business, leave it alone. Neighbors, friends, and family said, no, just like Pam and Erin have been saying, actually, this impacts all of us, and especially when you get the most tragic outcome of somebody dying. But even before that, it's impacting all of us. And we all have a right and a responsibility to be able to say, I see what's going on, and I'm here to help you. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not here to make you leave the situation. That's never our role. But there are many, many ways that we can help. We can ourselves learn about what resources are available in the community. Resources like Erin's shelter. And rather than just giving somebody a phone number and saying, well, call there, you can sit down and you can say, look, you know, I've talked to the shelter myself. This is what they can do, or I can make the phone call with you. So the idea is not to leave people on their own. So Neighbours, Friends, and Families, we do that with information on the website. You can download that information. We can also do that through little training sessions. And that's where Christine is really going to be working with people like Erin to say, okay, how can Neighbours, Friends, and Families support the work that shelters and other organizations are doing as they reach out to the public? So we're going to be guided by that. I think you're hearing a theme here of this is not top-down work. This is really bottom-up work. You know, you're people who are close to these situations. What do you need? You tell us. We'll help you figure it out. That's essentially what Neighbours, Friends, and Families is about. I'll just leave it there, but I'm happy to answer more questions in the discussion period too.
Barb, is it not the case that since Neighbours, Friends, and Families got started, you've also partnered with other organizations to do a number of variations of Neighbours, Friends, and Families that speak to particular communities? Can you talk just a bit about that?
We have, sure. We have had a lot of adaptations. So the very first adaptation was a Francophone campaign called Voisin, Ami, Famille. And so they have a very similar set of resources. The next one was, we didn't call it an adaptation, we called it a recreation of the campaign for Indigenous communities. That one's called Ganawituin, which means taking care of our spirits. And then there was another adaptation of the campaign with OCASI, which is the Ontario Coalition of Agencies Serving Immigrants. And so there are a lot of different organizations that serve immigrants that have taken the Neighbours, Friends, and Families resources and figured out how to make them make sense for the Muslim community, how to make them make sense for the Chinese community, for whatever community that they're working with. We also, though, we've done a few other things that are pretty interesting. We worked for a little while with hair salon professionals and aesthetic professionals. And we have a campaign that they actually did it first in the United States called Cut It Out. And so we've done some trainings with hairstylists because they hear lots from their customers. They often have a trusting relationship. And that's really at the core of this work, right? If somebody trusts you, they'll talk to you. And so then if when they ask you questions or when they start to tell you what's going on in their lives, if you have at hand some easy information that you can pass on, or you just know how to validate them and their experience. And so we were teaching hairstylists how to do that. Very successful campaign. The resources are still there again. We also adapted Neighbours, Friends, and Families to go into workplaces, and that's called Make It Our Business. So there's a Make It Our Business website. Yeah, everything on there is free of charge. Lots and lots of information if you're an employer, if you're a coworker. There's even some information on there for unions. So that, you know, oftentimes we have relationships with people in our workplace, and oftentimes those warning signs, they show up at work, those high risk factors, we're seeing them at work. And so, you know, the Make It Our Business has all kinds of tips and tools for having those conversations when you're at work.
Maybe we need to put our heads together and create an adaptation for rural communities.
I think it's a really, really good idea, really timely. And, you know, along with the toolkit that you've done for Luke's Place and Neighbours, Friends and Families, you know, I just see us as like, we're the ground level. We're the very basics that, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. We all should know how to do this. We should all know, you know, how to recognize that abusive relationship and how to make a simple outreach. That's not controlling. It's not telling somebody what to do, but it's saying you're not alone. And I just want to say one more thing, and that is that oftentimes when we do recognize warning signs or we do try to talk to somebody, they're not going to tell us what's happening right away. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it can take a really, really long time. And so one of the main messages of Neighbours, Friends and Families is don't give up. Don't give up on your friend. Don't give up on your sister-in-law. Stay with her. Eventually, you know, as you build trust, she'll tell you a little more, and maybe she'll be willing to take a little step. It may not be the step that you thought or the step that you think is most important, but it's a step. So like, hang in. Just don't abandon somebody. Don't leave them in isolation.
Thanks, Barb. I'm just going to mention a couple of tools that people might find helpful, and I think, Anushka, you can put them in the chat. But then I want to turn it over to Anushka to help manage the questions that we have in the time that we have left. First of all, I mentioned that you can link directly to the recommendations, and you can see that link there. As well, there are two toolkits. One is the report on the inquest. It's called We Remember, and it walks you through the inquest from before it started until its conclusion. But woven through that report are tips for folks especially in smaller communities, who might someday become involved in an inquest. So there are tips about things like how to be a good witness if you're called at an inquest. How would you pick a lawyer to assist you? How do you handle the media? I mean, one of the things I don't think any of us had planned for at the time of the inquest last June was the extent of media interest in it. I do a lot of media. I'm comfortable with the media. I like talking, happy to have a microphone put in front of my mouth. I had no idea that I would be doing routinely 2, 3, 4, 5 interviews a day, a couple of podcasts a week. And so we've developed some tips about how do you manage that, especially if you don't have a lot of experience working with the media. So that's one toolkit. The other toolkit is specifically about the implementation of the recommendations. And if you're somebody, whether you're part of an organization or you're a person on your own, and you're listening to this today and you're thinking, okay, I want to do something, but I've never done anything like this before, so I don't even know where to get started, this toolkit is for you. And it's posted on the Luke's Place website. We have a banner at the top of our website that links you directly to it. In that toolkit, you'll find the recommendations, you'll find the bigger report that I just mentioned. But in there also are template letters to municipal politicians, to provincial and federal politicians. You can just adapt them, put in a bit of personal information or some information about your organization. There's a sample of an op-ed that you could submit to your community newspaper about the inquest and the recommendations coming out of it. We have information about, based on the work that Erin's done in her community, about how to support your community to include intimate partner violence in its community safety and well-being plan. We have tips for how to share information in a way that isn't going to violate any legislation. That's work that was done by Building a Bigger Wave. We've recently added a plain language analysis of the provincial government's response, or lack thereof, to the recommendations. So we add to that toolkit anytime that there's something new to share, which right now has been about once a week. We'll probably slow down at some point, but it's a very live toolkit. If you download it this week, you should go back and look at the website again in a couple of weeks, because there will probably be new tools in it that aren't there now. So I just want to mention those tools to folks, because I know what it's like. You know, when I was at the beginning of being an activist, and I would sometimes be really keen to do something, but I didn't know how to do it, and I didn't think anybody else was concerned about the same issue. It can be pretty paralyzing and pretty lonely feeling. And we're hoping that the toolkit is a way to help people feel like they can take that first step into activism. So, Anushka, do we have some questions?
Yes, actually we do. So first, thank you to the three of you for giving such detailed responses. I can say for sure that for a person like me who's just starting off in the field, it was really very helpful. So thank you. This is actually a question for Erin, and it goes back to the trauma-informed process you were talking about. So the question is, can you speak to how was that built into the legal process?
I'm not sure that I can speak to how it was built into a legal process, but I can certainly speak to how it was built into the processes of the day, every day. I think that the pace of the inquest spoke to people needing breaks, understanding emotional overload, recognizing triggers. I think that the intended people who were in the room. There was an Indigenous elder that was available in another room in another space every day to people who maybe needed some support. There were mental health workers with intention available in that space. Issues related to safety in this space were addressed openly without issue. There was space made for people. There were family members of one of the victims who one of them reacted about something that was being said. The process was stopped. Process was stopped to talk to the family and say, okay, what can we do to make this feel better? And so they changed the process and made space for that family member to be able to stand up from where she was comfortable and say what she wanted to say about the experience of her sister. So making room and making space for folks is also very much from a kind of trauma-informed approach. If we look at the way that the room was set up, there were plants in the room, there were snacks in the room, there was space in the room, like physical space in the room. Being able to know that, I was feeling particularly irritated one day, and Pam and I ingested, I'm not proud of it, but we ingested a whole package of Twizzlers in that one afternoon, in terms of ensuring that our oral places were occupied by Twizzlers so that we could manage some of the content of what was happening for that day. So for me, it wasn't necessarily the legal process. Nobody stopped the legal process, but what happened is there was some thoughtful thinking about how to make things feel inclusive and trauma informed, because we recognize that people that come into this room are carrying that trauma with them. So if there was an outburst, if there was a need for a break, if there was a need, you know what, today we're ending the day early. And we're ending the day early because people need that space and they need that time. It was that recognition on all levels, right? It wasn't just about the parties. It wasn't just about the jurors. It was about everybody in that process in terms of them playing a part. So I'm not sure if that responds to the person's question, but that is the response I have to offer. And thank you for the question.
Can I add a little bit to that? Because it was a legal process, and so certain things had to be done in a particular way. And what I really admired was the ability of the presiding officer to make sure those things happened, but in as low key a way as possible. So for instance, none of us were allowed to have any contact with the members of the jury throughout the inquest. We never knew their names. They were simply identified by their number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. and they were escorted in and out of the room by a police officer. But it was done in a kind of friendly way, not this sort of, okay, get back, you can't be near these people. And I think we all just made that commitment that we would follow that rule. The presiding officer, right from the get-go, said, let's just use first names. And so I think for people who weren't used to being a witness in a legal proceeding, that made everything a little de-escalated in terms of comfort level or anxiety. There were a couple of times when people needed to participate from a different room, so it was all hooked up online anyway. That was allowed to happen without any difficulty. So it was a legal proceeding. People who were giving evidence had to promise to tell the truth. But it was also collaborative. This wasn't a criminal trial. There wasn't the need to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. It wasn't adversarial. And some inquests are, but this presiding officer, supported, I would say, by the chief coroner's office, decided to try to bring some of that typical tension down among the people at the front of the room. And I think that had a big impact, on everybody else in the room too. It did feel to me most of the time, I mean, Erin, you're right, there was the Twizzler afternoon and a few other days where we heard stuff that made us really angry. But I felt that for the most part, people, the jury, the parties and their lawyers, the coroner's office and the presiding officer were there to work together to find a solution, as opposed to trying to ask a really tricky question of a witness so they would look good. Would you agree with that, Erin? It was a collaborative process mostly.
I would agree. It was collaborative. There was camaraderie. There was always a good morning to each other. It was, when one person, I mean, we were dealing with a pandemic, and when one person got sick, everybody was concerned about that person having COVID. And I'm glad that you commented about the legal process, because I think what I actually mean is that the intentional things that were put in place enhanced the legal process to make that legal process feel like it was reduced in terms of leveling that playing field, so people could go, what does that mean? And if somebody leaned over and said, what does that mean? Or if somebody had to go approach the tech person because somebody was messaging them saying they couldn't hear the Zoom broadcast, it wasn't that formality of that lineage of, this person talks to this person only, this person doesn't approach that didn't exist. So everything kind of enhanced that process of this. We're all in this together, and we all want something to come out of this that makes our community safer, and it makes things better. I think that was really, and I would agree that that all the parties, that the chief officer, that I think that they really they honored that commitment and that recognition of, we're coming into a community that's not ours. How do we make sure that we create that space to say we're grateful to be visitors when we want to work alongside you? And I think they did it very, very well.
Thank you so much for that. Barb, we have a question actually for you, which is, how do we engage with someone who is behaving abusively? And if there are any resources for that.
Yes, if you go again to the Neighbours Friends and Families website, we do have a few resources for that. So I think that I'll say, first of all, there's not a single answer to this. I think that if we're going to engage with somebody who's behaving abusively, the first thing to ask ourselves is, do I have a relationship with this person? If this is my brother, if this is my uncle, if this is somebody that I interact with regularly in some kind of a relationship, then I think that's a starting point from being able to intervene. And then when we intervene with somebody who's behaving abusively, we actually use a lot of the same principles that we do when we engage with a survivor. We talk about what we've seen, but only exactly what we've seen. We don't speculate. We don't ever share information that we may have gotten from the survivor, that could definitely put them at risk. But if we've witnessed yelling, if we've witnessed controlling behavior, we say, I saw this happen. And then we express our concern. We say, you know, I'm worried. I'm worried about you. I'm worried about your relationship. I'm worried about your partner. And then we say, the next piece is we tell the person that there's help available. And we ask them, do you know that you can get help for this kind of problem? Do you know that your relationship could be better and there are people who could help? And so it means that you have to do some homework ahead of time. So the main resource in the province of Ontario for people who behave abusively are called PAR programs, Partner Assault Response Programs. Every community has one. However, not every community is able to work with men who come there voluntarily. Unfortunately, we're still at a point where funding is provided for these programs after men have come through the criminal justice system. It is so backwards, and certainly we need to advocate to change that. But many PARs have found ways to raise money so that they can work also with men who come there voluntarily. So if you want to have that conversation, it might be a good idea to, first of all, yourself, call your local PAR program, talk to them about what you're seeing, and let them help you prepare for the conversation. But the key elements that we would teach neighbors, friends, and families is have a relationship with the person, only talk about what you see and witness personally, express your concern, and let the person know that there's help available.
Thank you, Barb. And now actually I would like to go back to the trauma-informed process, because there's another question on that, which is, how do we get court proceedings to implement trauma-informed process for survivors and their families?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I guess I should try to answer that question, but I am certainly not here to be an apologist for the legal system, because I think it's terrible. It's a really good question, and it's certainly something that advocates have been working towards for a long time. We have seen some movement. I don't think it's enough. So for instance, the implementation, I can't even remember when it started, but the Victim Witness Assistance Program was intended to provide a bit of a buffer between a victim of a crime and the court process by providing information before the date that the victim would have to appear in court, by helping them keep up to speed about any bail conditions that had been imposed, and being a bit of an intermediary between the victim and the Crown. I think that Victim Witness provides a really important service, but I'm not sure that it's exactly bringing a trauma-informed approach into the courtroom. We have seen in some communities, there are trauma dogs that a witness can use when she's testifying. I think that's fantastic. I just think, you know, a four-legged furry animal always makes, well, I shouldn't say that, probably some people don't like them, but it almost always makes people feel a little bit better. There are other small steps, and I hope I was clear how I started this answer. I'm not saying any of this as though it's enough, or you know, to apologize for the legal system. There are ways people can give evidence behind a screen or in another room if it's too terrifying for them to be in the same room as the person who has caused harm to them. But the fact of the matter is that the criminal system, because it's adversarial, because the evidence has to prove that the person who's been charged is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, is seldom going to be an environment that can be particularly trauma-informed. It would sure as heck help if people understood gender-based violence, people meaning Crown attorneys, defense lawyers, police officers, and judges, better than many of them do. But I'm also interested in how we can bring a trauma-informed approach to family court, because for survivors of intimate partner violence in particular, they're much more likely to be involved in a family court proceeding than a criminal court proceeding. And for most women who've left a man who's been abusing them, their concern about the safety of their children is greater than anything else that they have on their mind. But family court is not trauma informed. It's a little more relaxed. It's a different standard of proof and so on. But again, until the main players in those systems have true, deep understanding of what intimate partner violence is, of the fact that it continues after separation, that legal bullying is an inherent part of it, survivors are going to continue to feel re-victimized at whichever court system they go to. I don't feel that hopeful. I don't have something positive to say. The systems are hostile. And that hostility is rooted in the fact that women are still not believed when they talk about their experiences of whether it's physical abuse, coercive control, sexual violence. It doesn't matter. We're not believed. Sorry.
No, thanks. That oh, Erin, you've unmuted. You said you would add something.
I just wanted to say that there are some very specific recommendations, not that I want to belabor the point, but some of the recommendations do speak to looking at education and training for just all justice partners. It does talk about trauma-informed training for all justice partners. It does talk about review processes. So there are some recommendations that I think can build and can fortify some movement around trauma-informed approach. We in Lanark County, we've already had meetings with our Crown to say these are the recommendations that seem to relate to you. Have you read them yet? Okay, well, let's have a discussion about how we can make that change. And if you're in a rural community, and you may have a courthouse that looks like ours, that is this beautiful, very, very beautiful building, but has absolutely no provision for privacy and for safety, and their hallways are narrow and the corners are sharp and all of those things. And so I think even beginning to have conversations where we talk about the safety within the structure of the physical building is working towards something, right? So I think that, I think that there are means within the recommendations, if one looks through them, there is a means by which we can also be saying, hey, let's work on this trauma-informed piece around the physical structure. Let's weave that into how we take breaks for court appearances. I think there is a way. I think that that all the parties got to come together and be agreeable. And where it's an adversarial system, I agree with Pam, it's important to look at the win-win, right? The win-win-win. How could everybody win? The woman won't recant and the woman will show up, and the woman, if the police are engaged and they're treating the victim in a particular way, we know that the outcomes and the successes are better when victims can navigate a system where they feel valued, right? So I think that there are many recommendations that relate to those things, and that was the addition I wanted to make. We do have a last comment that I want to make sure to get in, to say that not everybody on this call might be interested in reading and listening or whatever, but I also want you to know that art has been a really meaningful part of the process of healing in Renfrew County and in many counties, working with Redefine Arts. And Redefine Arts has created pebble mosaics in various communities that evolved through a process that's rooted in community, where they ask people what would be the intention if there was a mosaic in your community that spoke to gender-based violence. And it's a process where it engages people, and then you end up building that mosaic together, where you are putting those pebbles and those stones in the mosaic. And there are many, and there was a mosaic that was unveiled on September 22nd,
Yeah,
2022. And it's in Barry's Bay, and it's the Barry's Bay Inquest, Inquest mosaic. It is a stunning piece of art that had many, many people's voices and intentions put into that. And I just think that there are other ways to engage in the process of healing and being part of solutions that maybe aren't all the traditional ways. And so, art is a way to speak to that, and to connect one's spirit and intention to something that lives on. And so, perhaps you might consider going and visiting one of the mosaics, because there are many. There's some, and we have 3 in our county. We have a new one being unveiled in Smiths Falls in May. maybe you'll be engaged in a different way. And whatever way you choose to be engaged, if you're engaged, then you're part of that solution, right? So just trying to give that alternative kind of, there are different ways, different paths for people. So just wanted to make sure to share that before we ran out of time today, and to thank my colleagues and everybody for continuing to, bring this rural voice to your forums.
Thank you so much, Erin, for bringing that perspective in, because it's really important. Like, not everybody enjoys reading, so just different ways of community engagement. So thanks for that, Erin. And I think we're at 3 p.m. So unless like anybody has like any concluding remarks, I would then go ahead and close. But I would just like to give a few minutes to our speakers here in case they want to give any concluding remarks.
I think this was a great opportunity. I hope that we can find ways to continue to mesh together the work of Neighbours, Friends and Families and the work coming out of the Inquest. And all of you who were joining us on the Zoom this afternoon, there is a path for everyone. We all have different paths, and we hope that what we've shared and some of the tools we've shared can help you find the path that's right for you, because this is an epidemic. And we need to work together collaboratively to end it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Pam. I also want to thank everybody for joining us, and just say that I hope you'll stay connected in some way to the Neighbours, Friends and Families campaign. I hope you'll give us feedback about what we're doing, what we're not doing, what we need to do. We're really open, and the campaign is really there to help you to do to be more involved in this issue, without expecting you to become a professional. That's just not needed to do a lot of good. So thanks for being here today.
On that note, as Barb said, we would really like to hear from you about what events we can have, what improvements we can make, what conversations we can have more. So here is a feedback form in the chat box. If you can fill it out, we would really appreciate it. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us in today's conversation. The NFF team would like to thank the speakers here taking our time and having this conversation. Thank you so much, Pamela. Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you so much, Barb McQuarrie, for being here. And I can say that I personally learned a lot from the three of you, and I'm just very grateful. Thank you so much. There are several questions actually in the Q&A box, and we may pass them over to you, Pam and Erin, and in case you have time. Then we would love to hear back some of the responses, and we can share them with our audience later on. And then again, in the chat box, there were several links that were shared at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. And there's also a feedback form. Again, we would really appreciate it if you can fill it out. Again, so thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.